Every person who's ever worked with me has always come to me with a unique set of goals that they want to achieve as a runner. But there's always one universal goal that I find with every runner, whether it's people I work with, people I meet at running groups, people I meet at races, or just runners I see online. Every runner wants to get faster. And it's pretty understandable because pace is one easy metric to compare against your past self to see if your fitness is developing. But when a runner comes to me who's been logging 10, 20, 30 miles a week and they're not seeing their pace increase, I don't look at their speed work first. Instead, I look at what they're doing for their easy runs. Running culture, whether intentional or not, has just become hyper focused on pace. And we use it to compare ourselves to others all the time, whether we intend to or not. Whether we talk about Strava and how it just broadcasts pace out in kind of a competitive way, or if we talk about running influencers who post their paces and make claims about what paces are normal for running or easy, or we can even just look at run groups where people run together and the people at the start are having an easy time and the people at the back are struggling to keep up but won't give up. Pace is just a thing we all have some ego attached to and all have our beliefs about what is a good or bad pace for ourselves and for others. And if you don't believe me, let me just ask you, when was the last time you were able to keep your pace even when other people were running around you? We all subconsciously speed up. We do it when we're out for training, we do it at the start of races because there's something about seeing other people go faster that pushes us when we know we can go faster to speed up. The problem with that, though, is that runners end up going faster than they should most of the time, especially when the training session is meant to be easy. They go fast because it feels productive. And with almost everything else in life, the way you get better at it is by doing that thing repeatedly. So, at first glance, it seems to make sense that if you want to get faster as a runner, you should just try and run as fast as you can all the time and let your body adapt to that. But the issue is adaptations for runners don't work that way. And this is honestly one of the biggest paradoxes and most confusing aspects of how running fitness is developed. So to explain what's going on here and how to actually develop good adaptations, let me just really quickly introduce the concept of heart rate zones. Heart rate zones are different ranges for how fast your heart is beating. Most coaches will use either 5 or 7 zones. I personally just use 5 zones to keep it easy. Zone 1 is easy, light activity. Zone 5 is all out intensity. And for most runners, zone 3, moderate intensity right in the middle, is where they feel most natural as a runner. The issue with zone 3, though, is that it's too intense to create base level adaptation, and it's not intense enough to create performance adaptation. And so, if you're always running in zone 3, that kind of moderate intensity, which honestly is where most runners feel the most natural and comfortable if just left to their own devices, you're running too fast and too intense to develop your base foundational aerobic capacity, but you're also running too slow to really develop any actual speed or power on top of that foundation. You're just left with a lot of fatigue and not really any great adaptation. And that's why people's pace stays the same for so long. They're not mixing up their training enough to develop the fitness at either of those ends of the spectrum. And that's why you'll hear a lot of coaches say things like run slower to get faster. Now, I did just mention that there is 2 ranges to work at, base foundation and speed and power work. But until you develop that base foundation, it's really hard to develop that speed and power work on top of it. So what does this mean in terms of what's going on adaptation wise? Well, it's honestly not that complex once you kind of break it down. So when you run at a lower intensity in zone 2, or you might hear it be called a conversational pace or your all-day pace, your heart isn't working as hard as if you're in an all-out sprint, but harder than if you're walking, and that creates some very specific adaptations. First, your muscles develop more mitochondria, which helps generate the power in your muscles. Second, you develop more capillaries in your muscles, which helps get more blood flow and more oxygen into those muscles so that they can work more efficiently. And third, your blood plasma volume changes, which also helps with delivering more oxygen to your muscles. And together, all three of these combine into that aerobic foundation, which basically just means your body can work more efficiently and deliver more power for less effort and cost to you. But when you train too intensely all the time, you don't get those adaptations because you're using different energy systems and firing different muscle fibers in your system that are used for speed and power. And so those will develop differently. But again, if you don't have that aerobic foundation to begin with, it's still hard to develop those speed and power systems on top of a weak foundation. That's why low intensity training is a prerequisite to developing any real power and speed as a runner. Once you have that strong foundation, it just becomes a lot easier to build a speed and power level on top of it. So, just to give you a personal story, before I knew any of this, my easy days, I would try and run at around a 9:30 pace because my 5K pace at the time was around 8:45. And I just thought if I could keep running as close to 8:45 as possible in all my training sessions, I'll just get faster at 5Ks. But I really wasn't improving week to week, even after months. But then once I learned about zone work and figured out my zones, I started training more frequently at zone 2. I dropped down to a 13-minute pace, which felt embarrassingly slow at the time, and I would shuffle my way down the sidewalk while being repeatedly passed by other runners out there. But it was an easy pace. I wasn't breathing that hard. It just felt slow. But within a few weeks, at that same intensity level, my pace started picking up. Eventually, it became closer to 11 minutes. Now, several years later, depending on my training cycle, my zone 2 pace is anywhere from a 10:30 mile to a 9:30 mile. And my 5K pace is under 8 minutes. By doing this type of training for so long, I'm able to do more intense work without my body having to work so hard to do it. Now, here's the thing. I'll be totally honest with this. Every athlete I work with, I start them on zone 2 training for exactly the reasons I just laid out. And they hate it. It's really frustrating because you don't really feel like you're running in the first few weeks of doing this. It's more of a shuffle or a speed walk. Mentally, it's probably one of the hardest training modes for runners because it requires you to slow down for long periods of time until those adaptations start to build up. It honestly takes a lot of discipline. But without fail, every one of my runners that I work with ends up coming back after a few weeks, starting to notice the changes, starting to notice how they can go faster with feeling like it's easier to do. Their pace starts picking up and they start to understand why they're doing this training, and it just becomes a normal routine for them. And then on top of that, we can start building more intense speed work to really develop their power and really start pushing that pace. So if you've stuck around this long and you're wondering what zone 2 is and how you can do it yourself, there's two ways we can talk about it. The first is pretty technical, getting a heart rate monitor, figuring out where your thresholds, your max heart rate are, doing a 20-minute test and then breaking that down to figure out where your zones are. Or you can go with an approach that's available to everybody out there, which is called the talk test. The reason zone 2 is called your conversational pace is because if you're running at that pace, you should be able to have an easy conversation because your muscles will not be demanding enough oxygen to cause you to have to interrupt your speaking pattern. So if you're able to talk like I am right now, that's your conversational pace. If you start having to take breaths between words, you've probably slipped up into zone 3 and need to pull the intensity back a little bit. So one thing to note is that your body repeats what it's used to. So if you haven't done zone 2 training before and you're used to running at higher intensities in most of your training, that's what your body's going to expect. So when you go out slower, it's going to be harder for your body to keep your heart rate at that lower level because every time you jump up a curb or start to go up a hill or even talk, that's going to be seen as extra stress, extra intensity, and your body's response is going to be to kick your heart rate up to where it's used to being for your exercise. So what this means is for a lot of runners, in these early phases of developing their zone 2 running, they'll need to walk quite a bit because your heart rate will just jump up and you got to slow down to bring it back down into zone 2, and then it'll jump right back up again and you got to slow down. But if you stick with it long enough, over time you're going to see your heart rate get real even at that zone 2 level. And in fact, that'll carry over to every level. That as you increase your intensity, your heart rate will go up with it and it'll stay even with it. And when you bring that intensity down, it'll drop quickly and stay even with it. It's actually one of the nicest benefits of doing this type of training beyond the adaptation that I talked about for speed, is that your heart rate gets really even. And so just keep that conversational guideline in mind when you're out there running. And if you're running with other people, let them know you're going to stick to a zone 2. Let them know that you might need to slow down for the training you're focused on and that it's okay if they go ahead. Experienced runners will know exactly what you're talking about and understand exactly what you're doing. The point is that you are focused on building your aerobic engine so that months and years from now, you can be a stronger runner. You can go faster without it feeling like as much of an effort as it is today. Which is why, as coaches, we say run slower to get faster. Because if you spend the time developing that strong aerobic engine as your foundation for everything else you're doing, you will be able to do much more intense running things for a lot less effort. And that's really the goal every runner wants when they talk about getting faster.